Okay, hello Year 10. So in today's lesson I'm asking you to write a conceptualised opening. And I know this is something that you've done before, but I thought it would be good to have a bit of a quick recap. So remember that these are the key literature skills in order to get into Band 6. So we need to have a concept, we need to have a big idea and line of argument, it needs to be critical. So we need to evaluate the success of the methods. Does that simile work, for example? Is there another area of the play where a representation of that character is more successful? Having a line of argument and sticking to it means that you're going to be convincing. So don't be balanced, know the play, have perceptive things to say. Now, if you get something that says to what extent, for example, don't decide it could be this, it could be that. Try and take a stance wherever possible. Your analysis needs to be layered and you need to use accurate terminology. And remember that we don't quote too soon and we don't put too much emphasis on analysing every single quote. We choose the best quotation to milk and pick apart, and actually our responses will be more sophisticated if we analyse wider methods such as the use of the sonnet form or iambic pentameter rather than zooming on individual word choices. We also need to have an exploration of effects, ideas and context. So write about purpose and context, have multiple interpretations, including different audiences. So how would an audience of today react in comparison to an audience at the time in the Elizabethan era? You also need to choose quotes and part of the text that are cleverly selected. So make sure that they link to your argument, make sure they're precise, make sure they're integrated into your response. And also remember that sometimes an effective reference can be when Romeo was banished to Mantua, for example, is just as useful for your argument as remembering a specific quote with keywords. Okay, so they're the key skills, but we're just going to focus on conceptual today, having a big idea and a line of argument. We'll return to these different skills throughout the course of this scheme of work. Okay, so this is something that my Year 11 group put together. Now, we need, in order to have a conceptualised response, we need to think about what the themes, messages are, and also what the big ideas and concepts are. So if we were writing a question about love, for example, we might consider Romeo's impulsive nature and how this causes his downfall or hamartia. So this could be, remember we don't know, we have to be tentative, a warning about the dangers of trying to grow up too quickly. So love is important for ensuring the status quo or the social order within society. There are different elements of love as well, unrequited love and Petrarchan love, courtly love. It can also link to ideas of chivalric bravery, the fact that women are presented as sexual objects, and the medieval church, and they reminded parents of their duty to consider their children's view in marriage. So actually we need to be nuanced when we consider context. We can't just say things like in that time all women had to get married to who their father chose and that was the end of it. Now we will return to all of these over the course of this recap on Romeo and Juliet. Okay, so this is your question. To what extent does Shakespeare present Romeo as a hopeless romantic? Now, what you can do when you're trying to think of your concept is you first of all need to identify the steer in this question. Now, that's the part of the question that changes, like the topic or the subject. Which theme does it link to? Which character does it link to? And in this question, you can see that it's Romeo as a hopeless romantic. Okay, so once we've thought about the steer, we can do one of three things. We can challenge the steer. Now, it's quite hard to challenge a steer when it says, to what extent does Shakespeare present Romeo as a hopeless romantic? However, you could say he doesn't present him as a hopeless romantic at all. He presents him as, and then that could be the whole of your line of argument. Consider multiple interpretations, meanings of the way the steer could be defined. So Romeo is presented as hopeless, and also, is he romantic? You could consider the fact that he is different things to both Juliet and Rosaline. You could also come up with a whole list of words, of ways that Romeo exhibits love, passionate devotion, pure religious love, courtly love. He's also presented as having unrequited love, treating women as sexual objects until he meets Juliet, and you could argue there that is therefore represented as a more pure love. Or you could consider the writer's purpose in relation to the steer. So rather than just thinking about, is Romeo a hopeless romantic, what is it that Shakespeare is trying to say about love through the character of Romeo? Now, I would suggest that that's probably one of the easiest of the options to take. And in this response, probably the one that you could go with. But you can use a combination of all of these different ones. So I would probably consider multiple interpretations and also think about the writer's purpose. So there are some verbs here that are useful in using when talking about the writer's purpose. So Shakespeare presents love in this way: to challenge, to galvanise, to reflect, to provoke, memorialise, etc. Now, in something like Christmas Carol, we're often seeing criticism or mocking. There may be elements of a warning in this text. It may be challenging and sometimes probably trying to reflect. Now, we've talked about this a lot. So you start with your opening, ultimately Shakespeare, and this could be your message, it could be your overarching view. And then you might want to put in some further things such as arguably. So ultimately, I would just answer this question in miniature. So ultimately, Shakespeare does or doesn't present Romeo as a hopeless romantic because, and then at the end of my paragraph, I would go into something like perhaps Shakespeare illustrates this element of love to warn about the dangers of acting too quickly, or to reflect society's values of using love to maintain order. I don't know, something along those lines. So we need to think about it like this. So we need to plan our conceptual opening or big idea. And this is all you're doing today. You're not doing anything else. But eventually we'll move towards a point where we're also planning our quotations and our key topic sentences. So we're having a big idea and then we're splitting those ideas into two. Okay, and we're sort of narrowing down. So starting wide and narrowing down as we go. That's why the triangle is upside down. Okay, so here's an example of one that I've done for a different question. So this question says, starting with this conversation, explore how Shakespeare presents the relationship between Romeo and Juliet. So conceptual opening, your big idea. So ultimately, so you can see I've started with that, Romeo and Juliet's love is presented as intense, rash, and all-consuming. Despite Friar Lawrence's warnings to Romeo to not act too quickly, it is his amartia and unavoidable. So that's my big picture, okay, my ultimate, because it says, how does Shakespeare present the relationship between Romeo and Juliet? And I'm saying that their love ultimately is presented as intense, rash, and all-consuming. Actually, using a list of three is quite useful there as well, and sophisticated vocab. And then I'm going into a bit more detail to show that I understand the concept of hamartia. So despite Friar Lawrence's warnings to Romeo to not act too quickly, it is his hamartia and unavoidable. Juliet too is desperate to mature too quickly. Her burgeoning sexuality and desire for new experiences outside the insular world of her drives her into Romeo's arms and leads them to take serious risks in pursuit of a life together. Her family, that should say. So therefore, I'm saying that I understand where they're both coming from on the two separate sides and why, so this is contextualising their love really. Indeed, throughout the play, Romeo and Juliet's passionate love is intrinsically linked with violence, and arguably the deepest mutual expression of their love occurs when the star-crossed lovers take their life, suggesting through the tragedy's denouement that their death was fated, inevitable, and inescapable. Another list of three because they're quite useful. Perhaps by connecting love with pain. So this is me summarising. That's their love ultimately, and I've got a couple of ideas there from my topic sentences. So you can see in my topic sentences, Romeo and Juliet's relationship is presented as intense, passionate, and true. Through Romeo and Juliet's relationship, Shakespeare exposes the danger of rushing into love. So the ideas explored in here go in there. Now I'm ending them with my perhaps. I've got my ultimately and perhaps. I have got an arguably in there as well. Perhaps by connecting love with pain and ultimately with suicide, Shakespeare is suggesting that there is an inherent sense of violence in many of the physical and emotional facets of expressing love, chaotic and complex emotion, very different from the idealistic ways often portrayed. Now, there are many elements of that you can use for the question that you're answering today. And what you'll find as time goes on is that actually you can reuse a lot of your conceptualised openings. Last year, for example, Year 11 produced some for Frankenstein that they realised they could use for a variety of different questions. Okay, and some quotes there that you might want to use as well. So we will talk about this briefly now. You start with your topic sentence, which answers the steer, okay, and then you've got to quote. So 5 or 6 quotes, explaining your point in more detail. Don't quote straight away, but just give a bit of background, etc. Then you embed a really juicy quote to milk, and then analyse that in more detail. Use your evaluation if you can. Okay, and then finally link back to the steer and then do it again. So you do your conceptualised introduction first, and then this is your method. Now, as I said, you're not going to write a full essay today. Okay, so just as a quick recap, your question is, to what extent does Shakespeare present Romeo as a hopeless romantic? And some of these ideas hopefully will help you in producing that. I don't want you to write any more than the opening, which is a short paragraph. It doesn't even have to be as long as this. Just try and take your time and think deep and think big about it rather than rushing into it. And as always, ask me if you've got any questions. Thank you.